in dealing with radicalization. Today, our speaker will be Merel Molenkamp. She is a colleague also from the RAN Center of Excellence, and she is, among a lot of other things she's doing there, co-editor of the guide of best practices we make, of which also family support is an important matter. I think I'm going to give the floor to you, Merel. Before I'm doing so, just start writing down your questions, and after a few slides of the presentation that Merel will do, we will have the first questions, so you will have your answers as soon as possible. Enjoy the meeting, and I hope you have a good time, either now live or later when you see it from the internet. Up to you, Merel.
Thank you, Martin. And first of all, welcome to all of you. Some of you I already know from the RAN network. Thank you for joining. And perhaps you also see some of your input in this presentation today. Of course, it feels a bit weird. I'm used to giving presentations, but not actually in an empty room. Also, Martin will collect all your questions, even though I have the opportunity to see them in the screen. He will collect them and make sure that we spend some time during the presentation as well to answer your questions. First of all, to share with you what will be the content for today's presentation. First, I will go into why there is actually a need for family support and why this is an important subject in relation to prevention of radicalization. Second of all, I will also tell a little bit more about family support in the context of the RAN. I know some of you are familiar with the RAN and some of you might not be, so we'll share some of our principles and how we look at these types of processes and interventions. Then I will go into the different phases of the radicalization process, of course related to what type of family support or what kind of things you need to take into account in different phases of radicalization process when it comes to involving families. It's also very important to look at solutions and ways to deal with family support. That's why we will give a number of examples of support interventions, which come from the RAN collection, which I will tell you about. And the session will end with some key lessons learned. I think it's important to say that the RAN is a network that collects all these insights on these important topics from first-line practitioners. So all the content that I will be sharing with you stems from this network and from these links that people from all over Europe have shared with us. To go into one of the most important things, so why do we need to focus on family support when it comes to prevention of radicalization, and why are families such a key partner in this? First of all, we believe that families in general can have a very positive influence on radicalizing relatives, and families and peers as well, of course. And often they don't really know these processes, or they're not aware of them, or they don't know what they mean. So these families need to be supported with knowledge and tools and other equipment to help their relatives. But if they have these tools and support, they can play a role in stopping the process of radicalization, of course, is what we are trying to do. To prevent them, for example, from getting into harmful activities. The example given here is the one you probably know well, is people traveling to Syria and Iraq, but it could also be joining a violent extremist right-wing group. Families can help make sure that that moment doesn't happen. Also, the step to violence, we'll go into that a little bit later, is where the RAN is really focused on to prevent people to really become violent. And families have a very important role in that, whether it's in a prevention trajectory or even after people have exited a violent group. They can be a great barrier to avoid people becoming violent again. When people have, for example, traveled to Syria, family members are often a powerful voice to convince them to come back or to offer them alternatives in their home country, and also they can be an important place, safe place to return to, and that's why also these families need to be supported to actually have a good family network to come back to. Families can also help build bridges to authorities. It's not always the case that authorities and families have a very good relationship. There is fear, there is uncertainty around, for example, the police. And families can play a positive role as role models also to other families, that these relationships can be built. Of course, when people are involved in de-radicalization or exit programs, families can be a great motivator for them to stay in that program or to convince them to try and disengage or de-radicalize. There's always a great danger within families that if somebody is getting radicalized or even radicalized already and into extremist activities, that they will influence their brothers or sisters or nephews or other peers. And families play an important role to stop that process of recruitment within the family. And finally, of course, we hope families can play a role in preventing crimes and terrorist attacks that in the end hurt a lot more people. So that's why we are convinced that family support is a really important aspect of prevention of radicalization. In the past, we have had a great role, and we still do, for authorities. We have an important role for first-line practitioners. That's what we focus on within the RAN. But there's also a very important role for communities and in the end, and families and individuals themselves. And that's what we are working on now. So what do we do with family support within the RAN context? First, I think it's important to share a number of the Radicalisation Awareness Network objectives with you so you understand how we get to our lessons learned. There are over 2,000 first-line practitioners within the RAN, and when we say first-line practitioners, we mean teachers, people from the health sector, people from prison sector, police officers, of course, mediators, people who in their daily work deal with individuals at risk or those who have already been radicalized. And we gather and organize exchange between these practitioners as well as with other stakeholders to make sure that the bottom-up knowledge, the knowledge from people who work in the field, actually reaches other levels as well. And can be used for research, for example. And this is what the RAN is trying to accommodate. Also, being an EU project, we try to deliver support to the EU as a whole, but also its member states individually, using the knowledge we get from these practitioners in the field to have tailor-made advice, for example, to specific member states. And finally, and this is a great example of that, this webinar, is we try to disseminate the learning we do in the network in all kinds of activities to a broader audience. And that's why this cooperation with the Deutsche Präventionstag is also very fitting in our objectives, that we hope to share these lessons around family support with a broader audience today. So a number of ways that within the RAN we are looking at some of these key terms. I want to share this with you because it's important, because it will make you understand how we look at family support as well. First of all, we think of radicalization as a process, not one particular state of mind. And we make a distinction between having extreme ideas and acting upon those in terms of violence. And the Radicalisation Awareness Network is trying to prevent the violence coming from a radicalization process. Also, this process is not linear. It's not that you can see it as one straight line. It's often, there are push and pull factors, there are trigger moments, and which can all of a sudden increase the speed of a radicalization process, but also mitigate it if there's something that, if there's an alternative option, for example. So we often make the comparison with the snakes and ladders game. I don't know if all of you know it, but some events might make you become extreme overnight. A traumatizing event, for example, losing your mother, while other things like getting a girlfriend might mitigate these processes quite as quickly as well. Another distinction that's important to us is the distinguishment between ideologically driven violence and other types of violence. We don't really focus that much on violence coming from gangs or from hooliganism, but really the type of violence that results from, for example, right-wing extremism, Islamic radicalization. So that's what the RAN is focusing on, and this is the type of violence that we also talk about when talking about supporting families in preventing this from happening. Another important thing to keep in mind when listening on our view on family support is the RAN DNA, which was built actually from all of the last 4 years of talking with first-line practitioners. So the first one's not very surprising. We think that involving first-line practitioners and training them to deal with this issue is vital in your approach. They are the ones who can make a difference on a day-to-day basis, just doing their regular job, but having a clear idea of how to maybe detect or signal radicalization, where to go with these signals, or how to deal with them, or how to converse, for example, with a student if you're a teacher, or with a patient if you're a mental health worker. We think that working with these first-line practitioners is very important. And they will also be the ones to deal with families if they are getting extra support. Second point is the prevention. Of course, it's also very important to have law enforcement in place, a good judiciary system to deal with crimes following from radicalization. But we think that in the long term, we need to win this battle by having a very good prevention strategy and make sure that people do not get on this path of radicalization, find alternative ways to deal with frustrations, anger, fear, and all these things that might trigger people into becoming extremists. A third point is multi-agency approach. As with a lot of social problems and challenges, not one organization can tackle this alone, and you will need an approach that encompasses a cooperation between different agencies that will be involved, like the police, but also especially NGOs, civil society organizations, people who have an interest in keeping their own people safe, communities at risk, but also victims. People who have been a victim of terrorist attacks can be very powerful voices in prevention, and formers, people who've experienced what it means to be part of an extremist group or stream, and who have somehow been able to move away from that. They can be an inspirational source and also a sort of knowledge for in the prevention approach. Finally, something that's been also mentioned often, tailor-made interventions. They are key. We cannot just copy a good practice from Germany to France. They need to fit the local circumstances because each of these circumstances has its own dynamics. So the interventions that I will come back to later at the end of the presentation, you also should keep that in mind, that you just can't copy a model and they will be adapted to local situation. Finally, a lot of what I will be telling you about and the examples that I'll be giving have also been collected in the RAN collection. Now it encompasses almost 100 practices from different member states. It's not a stamp for this is the best practice, but it's a book of inspiration that you can get ideas of approaches and practices that are being used in different countries. They give you examples, and we have the contact details with all the practices, so you can look for counterparts to share your own experience with or to learn more. The collection is an evolving tool, so it will be updated every 3 months with new practices, and every year we will also update all the lessons learned that are in there. And there is a specific chapter on family support in there on which this presentation is based. So if you want to read more about it, you can look into that chapter. That said, I think we are ready for first round of questions, should there be any?
Well, I look at the chat, Merel, and I see that either you're very clear or everyone has lost you, but that's not true because we're getting more attendees all the time. So I think it's clear so far. But perhaps I have one question I could pose you is, some people will say that radicalization might stem off education, and so perhaps even might be caused of how families are functioning. And why are you saying then that families are key to involve when it comes to radicalization prevention?
Well, I will come back to that as well. That families can have a very dual role in this, because indeed in some families the family is actually contributing to a radicalization process. So in these cases, it might not always be smart to involve the family, and this is something that needs to be assessed at the beginning as well, especially if first-line practitioners are called in for help. It's also dependent on which family member we are talking about. There might be a brother who has a negative influence, but there might be an aunt who can have a positive influence. So this should also be taken into account.
Okay, well, let's leave it there with this only question now, and you just go on with your presentation.
Thank you very much. So there will be another moment for questions after the second part of this presentation, which will go into the different phases of radicalization and the type of family support you can be thinking about. Let me first say that, as I said, this is not a linear process. So what I'm doing now is a bit theoretically, these phases, but you can distinguish them, of course, at some point in time. So when we begin, some of you might recognize this triangle in the bottom of my slide, which is used also by the Aarhus model in Denmark. The first phase, of course, is early prevention, or creating a general awareness. We are talking about the majority of people and families that do not have are not directly dealing with radicalization, who could be at risk, or maybe not even, because we can say that all families might be at risk in some way, because it's not always the case that vulnerable communities are only a victim of radicalization process. It can also be wealthy families, as we've learned from cases of people leaving to Syria. The profiles have been very different. So many families can be affected by this. So investing in early prevention is actually a long-term investment of making families resilient to another type of social challenge that can come on the path of their relative, just like drug abuse, gambling debt, lover boy problems. Radicalization is also something that could happen in your family. So a general awareness is for the majority of people, and for example, you can think about addressing challenges that can exist because people live in countries and have different cultural backgrounds, which sometimes in terms of norms and values seem to clash. And I think we've all seen examples where second or third generation youngsters are struggling with these differences between the culture of their home country and the culture of their parents. And this might lead to tensions. And we found that families and parents need some support to address these differences, and how can they talk with their children about it and not treat it as a taboo, for example. So addressing these general challenges can be a form of early prevention. Also, in terms of general awareness raising, you should think about information nights at school, or in a neighborhood home. These can be just to explain to parents or peers or teachers that this might be a risk, or that extreme ideas might sometimes be said by young people, for example, and how can you deal with that. This is more of a general approach, and it's really important to do that by involving schools and civil society organizations and those type of organizations and groups that are also normally involved in stimulating the well-being of the community members and youngsters. And it's also really important, since it's a long-term investment, to build this trust early on with families and with communities. We've heard examples where at the point that the situation was already tricky, that authorities or first-line practitioners wanted to connect with families and communities, and they were saying, well, you have never shown interest before, so why all of a sudden now when there is a problem? So in terms of early prevention, it's very important to, within your country and local communities, to build trust just in general before even focusing on these types of topics. So that's a general awareness raising, which in a lot of countries and local areas is already being addressed on a lot of topics, and this could be one that could be added to the program. Another phase is where there actually may be signs of the radicalization process being started for a child or a sister or a relative. And there are signals of that, and maybe a teacher or maybe a family member or a peer or a friend has seen these signals. And then it's really important that a risk assessment takes place. And I don't mean a risk assessment in the form that we sometimes hear from intelligence services or from the police, which are quite extensive. But there needs to be some sort of assessment that, is this situation critical? For example, is it a signal that somebody's saying, well, tomorrow my brother or I think my friend will leave to Syria, which means that really quick action is necessary? Or is it more of a signal where you say, well, all of a sudden my daughter is really interested in Islam and I don't know what to do with it? So there needs to be a risk assessment on the situation and how severe or critical you think it is, because depending on that, it will see who should be involved in helping this family. Maarten already in his question addressed that the role of family and peers can also be negative in some cases. And if it's negative, of course, interacting with those family members that have a negative influence of peers is not very desirable, and actually should be seen if there's a possibility to keep the individual involved away from those family members or peers. But this is not always something that you can see in first sight, and sometimes more interaction is necessary with the family before you can know if this is actually the case. Practitioners have told us that voluntary cooperation in these kinds of cases is crucial. If the family is not willing to cooperate or to work together with a first-line practitioner on this topic, or they are not open for any help, then it's often better to back off. Of course, in critical cases, this might be different, and sometimes the police might be involved, and then there's a different type of conversation. But in these cases that we mentioned, where, for example, maybe somebody outside of the family is signaling something, and you're reaching out to the family and they don't want to get help at that point in time, it's better to not push and force them to do that. It's also really important that if you are starting your help, that you have a holistic approach and try to look at the family as a whole, as a system that everybody has its influence and dynamics in, and that it's not just that one individual that has problems. So you should look at it as a system and then find an approach or an intervention, which we will talk about later, that is tailor-made to that situation for that family. You often see that the first contact with families and peers can be difficult, especially if there are no warm contacts already through perhaps different professionals. Making the first step can be difficult, and therefore what a lot of countries are trying to do is to make it easier for families to come to to professionals that can help. And now we'll come back to that later. One form that's being used often now are helplines, and I will share a little bit on that later in this webinar. Something else to keep in mind is that there are a lot of dynamics that play a role when you're supporting a family that is struggling with these processes. There can be cultural differences or cultural elements, but also the feeling of honor, a feeling of shame. Sometimes families don't want to speak out because they really feel ashamed in the eyes of the rest of the community. Or they can be very fearful because they think if they say something, the police will come and take their child away, or will arrest them. So these are all kinds of emotions that first-line practitioners working with families need to deal with, and also a lot of uncertainty. So what's going to happen now? What's going on with my child? We often hear these cases when people are converted, and the parents are not religious. They really don't understand what's going on. They can't relate to the child, and these dynamics play a role in trying to help the family, and that's why also a holistic approach is very important. So when we get to the very crucial phase, as I said, this is not like going 1, 2, 3, but at some point it might be that one of the children or relatives is actually in the state where there's extremist activity. This is a very broad category, so I've painted some situations. For example, they have left Syria or Iraq and to fight with IS. they are recruiting people in the neighborhood, they are attacking refugees, or even they can be in prison, or a situation that's not described here, but that we've often heard that parents have actually lost a child, for example, in Syria. One of the questions that many families have is how do I communicate, how do I interact with my son, daughter, nephew, niece who is now in Syria or who is now in prison, because I'm actually really angry, or I'm really afraid or scared or sad. So how do I communicate with my relative? And actually, families can often use a lot of support in that. We've heard examples that it's usually most effective to ask a question that a lot of parents would ask. For example, are you brushing your teeth? Are you sleeping well at night? To try to connect with your relative in a way that you normally would in a normal situation. And it sounds weird to do that, but these are often the most effective ways to interact. And families really need support in doing that, because their initial reaction might be very different. And also because of the new forms of media, people will be WhatsApping, for example, if they're in Syria, WhatsApping, trying contact, trying to get, for example, their sister to come as well. So how do you deal with that as a parent? That's something that needs support with. So this risk of recruitment is very real, of course, and the safety of the family is also at stake. Also, for example, in cases where a child or a relative has died, there are a lot of legal procedures and consequences to that. We've heard an example where a child has died, but of course it was not confirmed yet. The body wasn't found. So what do you need to do as a family? You are in mourning. Sometimes IS even tries to reach out to these families to say that their child has become a martyr, which is very confusing. And then you also have to deal with all the legal issues. As you can imagine, it's really important that there are good first-line practitioners with experience in that field to help them through this process. In cases where people have either returned from IS or have left a right-wing extremist group and have become part of a disengagement or a de-radicalization program, the involvement of the family and the support of the family is really important to make this program a success, and to give the individual and relatives the structure and support that they need to get through these programs, which are often not easy, and which we believe they should enter voluntarily. So the support of the family is very crucial in this element as well. So those are the three phases that we can roughly distinguish, in which families, as you can see, can need a lot of help to deal with quite difficult situations they've not been in before. So we have some room for questions if there.
Yes, we have a question, and that's from Alexander Vasilou, and she asked what interventions have been found to help families with violent right-wing extremism, and she especially is pointing at the fact that very often the ideology then is also supported by a part of the mainstream society, political parties and the media. So what could you do there?
Well, yeah, okay, that's a good question. Thank you, Alexandra. Yeah, I mean, especially in Germany, of course, there's been a lot of experience in dealing with families of right-wing extremists. To be honest, I'm not sure when you say around the political effect of that, and that a lot of the people have become that right-wing has become to some extent mainstream. That's always difficult, of course, where we draw the line. But there's been a lot of experience that in Germany, and I'll have some examples of that at the end of the presentation as well. And what was the first part of the question again? Sorry, Martin.
Well, the first part of the question was it was on right-wing. The fact, are there any programs on that? And then, especially when media and political parties are more or less legitimizing the thoughts of the radicalized person.
Yes. To be honest, in the case where the cases that we've discussed, I mean, there's not, this is not, then we are talking, of course, when violence has happened, and this is even more to the far right than, say, than what would be condoned by media and journalists. But I'll make sure you will get some examples of the right-wing family support that we have within the RAN. And we'll come back to it at the end as well.
What's happening now on the chat is interesting, because the chat is not only for giving, for posing your questions, but also for giving suggestions and answers, of course. And William Baldet is saying that in the UK they are using one-to-one mentoring with anti-racism practitioners if they need a tailor-made approach. So I think that's, well, it's a good adding up into your presentation.
Yes, for sure. And I think that's also, that's already a good thing. Is it also already in early prevention? I can see, I can guess.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I see that a lot of things are happening now. Yes, we get also a website link to which tailor-made information you can do in German and English on Lodisa House, who are working on right-wing extremism. So we already get a lot of answers.
Yes,
that's very well. I think this is also a good moment to look for the best practices you have to present. The floor is yours.
Yes. I have to get to the right button. Okay, great, thank you. So some intervention examples. I just mentioned already the helplines, which are actually popping up all over Europe at the moment. Last December, we had a meeting on this with a number of member states who have developed these helplines already, and it was a very helpful meeting to get insight into how do you use these helplines and how do you set them up. I've put some examples of countries at the top of the sheet here. First of all, it's really important to distinguish a helpline and a hotline, not necessarily in terms of what it's called, but its aim. That I think many of you are familiar with the hotline for the police, for example, to report crime, to report suspicious behavior of activities. The idea of a helpline is different. It's of course the idea of offering families, teachers, community workers with a safe telephone line where they can not so much report signals as well as discuss signals or express their concerns when they think somebody in their close circle is maybe going through a process of radicalization. These helplines are often more, they provide information, they listen, they try to decide whether these are serious signals or that maybe something else is going on. And most important, they are not directly usually related to the police. However, the organizational form of these helplines can differ, as we've learned. For example, in the Netherlands, the helpline is run by an NGO, and it's operated largely by volunteers, whereas in France it is part of the national authorities, and in that way has a close connection to the police. So there are different forms in organizing these helplines. What are important things to remember if you want to establish a helpline is that transparency is very important. If you have a connection to authorities, be clear about what it is. Mostly people know that, and you will be informed at the beginning of the call that should you give any information that leads to think that somebody will harm himself or others, that this needs to be reported to the police or to other authorities. So it's really important to make that clear. Otherwise, all the helplines that we've learned from are anonymous, and they are also confidential contacts, and people don't have to pay to call the number, which of course also lowers the threshold. As you can imagine, the people working on the phones, it's really important that they are very skilled and that they know what they're talking about. That they know something about the topic of radicalization, of course, but also to have good communication skills and sometimes to speak in different languages. To have that offer also lowers the threshold for people to call. It's really important that they have some kind of background as in psychology or social work or community work, professions, and education that focus on working with people around social issues. Of course, the staff around these helplines are usually not only the people on the phone. Usually, there are also counselors that become case managers when it turns out that after a phone call the signals are quite serious and the family need further help. There's also more helpline staff besides that who also need to be trained for this. Radicalization is not the only problem that they might encounter in a family, so it's important that they also are trained or aware or experienced in dealing with other types of social problems, which sometimes families need help with too, and they don't know where to go. It's really important to have a multi-agency structure behind your helpline, so to say, that you can refer to or that you can ask help from or that you can discuss cases with that come from the helpline, and that can do a follow-up also on the situation. We also learned that just working in office hour doesn't really help, isn't really helpful in the helplines because, of course, these situations don't only happen then, and it's really important to have a 24-hour handling of these calls, or in some cases there is a website that people can report on as well. If there are at least ways that people can always reach the people around the helpline. We have made a very extensive report on these helplines, so if people are interested, we have compared we have made, well, not necessarily comparison, but we've looked into the German, the Austrian, the French, and the Dutch helpline in terms of how they've been set up, with what kind of staff they work, what are the budgets, etc. So if people are interested, we can share that as well. Another these helplines, they can also be a good way of early prevention, or the second phase where you think there are signals of radicalization. Then these helplines are very useful. But we've also heard cases that people have put very critical cases of people leaving tonight or tomorrow to Syria, and also called the helpline because they didn't know where else to go, or they found this is the most trustworthy option. So in that case, they are very useful. Another intervention example that you must have heard of, which also exists, of course, around a lot of other themes, are the support groups. It's important. You usually see that these support groups are set up like bottom up, so parents deciding to help each other and building this group, or as a civil society approach where a community initiative decides to organize such a group for parents or for peers or for other relatives. The main idea is that those who are sharing the same experiences or in the same situation can talk to each other, can support each other, can tell each other how they are dealing with it, can share their grievances or frustrations with others that can understand what they're going through. It's really important with these groups that it's about recognition and sharing of experience, but not necessarily blaming, because this won't really help the group any further. It is a good opportunity, as we can see some of the examples, that to build better connections to authorities who can provide help around legal matters. For example, you see the support group Sabber, who's active in The Hague in the Netherlands. They sometimes invite people from either the police or from the municipality to come to their support group to give some explanations on things that they don't understand how it works, the parents in the group. And this helps to build bridges between these parents and authorities. Also, in some cases, parents were being contacted by the media, asked for responses and interviews, and they don't always know how to deal with that. So these support groups can also be very helpful in sticking together and see how do you want to respond. Do you want to respond? In some cases, it can be positive to involve media. In some cases, it can also have a negative effect. It's also really important, if you have this group, that it's a safe space, that people feel this safety to share with each other their problems, that they don't think there are spies in the group or people using the information that's being shared for any other purposes. So it should be confidential. It's advised that note-taking might be actually might have a negative effect, because people think, why are people writing down what I'm saying? As you can imagine, especially in multicultural societies, as there are all across the European Union, sometimes people don't speak the language of the home country that well, and so it could be an option to have interpretation. However, within these support groups, the experience learns that interpretation might hamper the real sharing between people, and it's not always necessary to have interpretation to understand each other. So that's something to take into account, to think about as well, if you want to, if you hear that these groups are being started in your own local area, or if you want to start something yourself. So a number of examples. I've just put down the names here, but you can all find them in the collection of these where these support groups have been set up. Is in the suburb, has been set up in The Hague, in one of the neighborhoods that's been especially hit very hard in terms of people leaving to Syria and these things, and they've set up a parent support group. The mother schools from Austria, from Women Without Borders, where they offer mothers support groups and trainings to make themselves resilient and to deal with extremism all over the world, actually. Survivors for Peace from the Tim Berry Jonathan Ball Foundation for Peace, also built on the legacy of Northern Ireland conflict, and bringing together victims and informants of this battle to talk and to support each other and to rebuild these connections. So these are examples, but please read more about them in the collection. A third example of an intervention is counseling, which you're probably also familiar with. This is, of course, more of a personal, I call it a one-on-one approach, but I mean that more in the sense that not necessarily one person, but it can also be one person, but it can also be one family, and with a counselor or other type of first-line practitioner offering support. This is usually, of course, even a lot more intensive form of support when families ask for this type of help. It can be on the practical level. Often there are also a lot of practical issues that need to be dealt with that have a negative effect on the whole situation, but also on an emotional and a psychological level, that they need help. It can be both individual counseling, usually it is a combination of individual counseling and collective counseling. There's also talking to the family as a whole, and also with the relatives separately. A systematically approach. I mean, a systemic approach is usually used in this type of counseling, really tailor-made to the specific situation, and not only focused on the problems of the family, but looking for solutions together with the families. Examples of that are Hayat in Germany, from the Center of Democratic Culture, ZDK, but also, for example, recently established the Family Support Center in the Netherlands, that is also providing this type of counseling for families who have, for example, a relative in Syria. Again, more of these examples, not only for family support, but counseling in a lot of settings can be found in the RAN collection, should you be interested in more of those. Okay, I'm getting close to the end of the presentation, but I want to share with you some key lessons that we learned in general on family support that you will see follow also from these phases that we've been discussing and the interventions that we've seen. First of all, it's recommended that there is a very clear and preferably national strategy on how to deal with families. And I say preferably national, also local, of course, but sometimes we see examples of families moving to another local area with another approach, which can be very disturbing for families as well. So having some sort of national idea or structure on what are the key principles of working with families is very helpful, and then at a more local level and tailor-made level, people can use these principles as guidelines and fill in further support from there. But it does secure that families feel treated wherever they go in the country the same. As I said before, multi-agency approach is crucial. We don't think there should be a maximum or a limit to the number of partners who can be involved. And also, this is not always something you can decide for yourself, because when you look into family dynamics, you might find that there are depth, there are all kinds of issues that different partners are already involved with the family that should also be involved if you work on these trajectories. However, we do recommend that there is one point of contact or case manager that that has the main line to the family, to make it also for them clear and to make it easier to build a relationship of trust with the family. When you look at these multi-agency structures, you often see that there, of course, are also, especially if in some stage security or intelligence services are involved, there are difficulties with sharing information. And this should be accepted from the outset that there are, for many professionals, for example, in mental health professionals, there are privacy limits that they can't cross. And for people in intelligence services, there are also restrictions to the information that they can share. And this is something that the family support approach should take into account, that there is not a freedom to share everything with each other, and there should be some agreement that the need to know information to support the family as best you can is in place. As said before, also transparency is crucial if you want to build trust with these families, which you need to do to make your interventions effective. Something to think about when setting up these type of support structures is the language you use, and how this could be the language you use in terms of your services or in how you engage with them, because sometimes some things are taboo. We had an example where they used the word therapy, which was in a certain community and families was really taboo, and that's why they didn't want to make use of the services that were offered, because they had a different interpretation of that. So it's important how you label the type of help you give. We often see that it's not always directly related to even the word of radicalization or extremism, but other terms that don't feel so directly problematic to these families. So that's something to keep in mind. As stressed before, it's really important as soon as there's initial contact with families to do some form of risk assessment. And it's not only at the beginning that this should be done, this should be repeated throughout the process. I don't know if risk assessment is even the best word, but it's to assess the situation and see what are the current barriers to improving the situation of this family, or what are their needs, and what are opportunities that we should use to get them to get especially the individual involved, but also the family as a whole, on a better path. And it should be an assessment throughout the process of help. We've often heard that families find it quite difficult to ask for help proactively because of the factors that we mentioned before: shame, fear, uncertainty. So lowering that threshold, for example, by the ways just mentioned by the helplines, is crucial if you want to interact with families and if you want to get these signals from them, and also for them to think, well, I don't have to go to the police immediately. I have somewhere else that I can go to share my concerns. Often these support structures are already in place in some way, either because of other social challenges that a local community needs to deal with, or a national authority. So we think we would advise to build on those support structures. So if there's already community initiatives that works with parents, maybe you can use these structures to also make a support group. It's not always a need to reinvent the wheel or to build everything new. And also because you want to use the expertise that you already have on other topics and from professionals in this area as well. It's also important to not wait too long with a response or to engage. Sometimes we've heard cases where a signal came in and it took so long to decide who should actually deal with it and whose plate it was on, that the real opportunity to build a relationship or trust with the family was lost. So doing nothing or waiting too long will probably in the end be more harmful. Clear rules and boundaries at the beginning of the conduct is also really important, because we are dealing with sensitive matter that can also sometimes have, well, as I said, legal consequences. If you share certain information about a criminal activity, for example, most professionals are obliged to call that into for the police. So it needs to be clear when you are dealing and interacting with families. They need to know what are also the limits and boundaries that you can work with. Also for the professionals themselves, because working in this field, especially with families that have been hit hard by extremism, it can be very intensive, and it can also be very intensive for the professional involved on a personal level. So having also some boundaries emotionally is really important. And finally, at some point, it might be a time to also things are going well with the family, problems have been solved, or there have been solutions, and the engagement can be winded down. However, it's never clear. We don't have any indication how long these trajectories take. We've heard examples from the helplines that they have been dealing with families for 3 years now and still engaging with them. So there's no time frame how long it will take, and it should have a clear assessment. Of if and when support can be winded down. And in some cases it might be never. You might be always want to keep in touch with the family to see how they're doing, if they've been particularly vulnerable. So this is something to keep in mind, and also in terms of support, that there's no time frame that you can put on that, not even an estimate. And it's really important to do a good assessment to see if support can become less.
Yes, and in the meantime,
So
a lot happened.
these were a number of our lessons
English
learned.
chat,
They're also in the collection.
We have a few. And
yeah, I'm
let's
ready
start
for a final round of questions.
with one who was asked by Jesper Holm, and he asked,
are any?
do you have any approaches or examples of projects which are still in the green zone? So not people who are already radicalized, but people who are vulnerable. And what could you do about programs on critical thinking and so on?
I think I have one of the interesting examples. Jesper, I know you were also at the education meeting we had in Manchester last year, beginning of 2015. There was a good example of actually a communication agency from the UK who built a program for schools to teach students about how propaganda works online. And I would say that that's actually something they don't even speak about extremism. They don't talk about radicalization. So, but they address the fact that you should look critically at the things you see online, and that people can manipulate you quite easily with pictures and words and ways of editing things. And they have a propaganda material for school that shows how this works. And they also have a program where they let young people make their own movies to show how you can influence people by images. And I personally feel that that's a very good example of an approach where you don't have to address radicalization or extremism, but you can work on resilience and critical thinking in a positive way.
We get more and more questions, and time is getting close, but let's go to the next one.
With a lot of the material coming to
you to
youngsters
elaborate a
online
bit on the
and in their
importance
own
of the
bedrooms.
independency of helplines. Why should they be independent?
Well, actually, we had quite a discussion on the independency of helplines, because in most countries they are Well, it depends on what we are calling independent. At least it's important that they are legitimate and trustworthy in the eyes of families. And that's something countries have been struggling with. Um, if families get the feeling that the helpline is actually a direct connection to the police office, then this might really be a big threshold to call this helpline. So it's important that at least there is a credible supplier behind the helpline that will help the people, and that they know that their information will not be automatically passed on to the police or put in a database, because those are the kind of fears that people have calling these types
Thank
of
you.
numbers.
Then we had another question by Noel
So
Klima,
independent, they don't need to
the
be
role
independent,
of
but they need to be
formers
credible and
support. Where
legitimate at
should they
least
be specifically useful or where
to the
not?
people you want to reach. To be honest, I don't have a lot of examples where formers have been used directly with families. There are more examples where they are involved in de-radicalization or disengagement types of programs to share their story, for example. And I mean, in some cases, there are formers who have become eventually very good practitioners dealing with these issues as well. So to be honest, I am not sure if there are a lot of experience already. Maybe people in the audience have it, but on actually using formers, at least in a one-on-one engagement with families. Maybe in general awareness, they can have a role telling their story or telling parents what to look out for, as well as in de-radicalization and disengagement
with the EU
projects,
report
but maybe not so much in
written by
one-on-one
Micha de
support
Winter
of
and
families.
Stijn Stiekeling from the Netherlands, which is a study about Denmark, UK and the Netherlands on the influence of families on radicalization. And she says actually in the report was that the families have only few influence when it comes to radicalization. Can you explain this, and do you think this is in line with your presentation? Was the critical question to you.
No, that's really a critical question. Especially, I know about the report, but to be honest, I don't have all the reasoning behind their conclusions to the forefront now. I think what we have learned from our practitioners that it's really difficult to not involve the family when you're trying to work with a person, because they're always part of some social network, and that's why maybe the term family is also family. That's why I try to talk about family and peers, because not everybody has the same relationship with their family. That's why it's important to in the beginning of dealing with, you should see who is actually the influential person and who has a positive influence on this person in his life. And it can be a family member. In many cases it is, but it could also, and a family member can also be an aunt or a grandma, but it can also be a friend or an imam or somebody from the community. So actually with these type of support, you should also look not only at the family, but at a wider social network and who can be a positive influence. And I think that
well, thank you very much, and thank you very much
our experience that we've heard from our practitioners is that they do feel that families can play an important role
before I say goodbye to all of
you,
you will receive an evaluation form, and you can give all the remarks you want to give to us for improving our performance. You will also be informed about the recorded version, which can be found online in short notice, and you will be informed on the next theme of our next webinar. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for the technical assistance to Stiftung Bürgermut, and on behalf of the Deutsche Präventionstag and the RAN Center of Excellence, I wish you a very nice day and thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.